Pittance and a promise. We've farmed for 40 years at Waters Meeting, a high-lying hill farm of nearly 300 hectares right at the top of Teesdale. The farm is owned by Raby Estates, so we're tenants rather than owner-occupiers. We run a flock of 280 registered Swaledale sheep and a small herd of pedigree Aberdeen Angus cows. All the farm is a site of special scientific interest, special area conservation and special protection area. The area is rich in minerals, particularly lead. Small farms were carved out of the scrub and moorland to provide a home and subsistence living for the families of lead miners. The summers are short and the winters are long, with average rainfall of more than 70 inches a year. 40 years here have taught us that it is easier to farm with nature rather than against it. That is why we keep hardy hill breeds that are not particularly commercial and don't start lambing until the spring and grass arrive in late April. We got it wrong this year, as this did not happen until late May. We're also highly conscious of the rich flora and fauna of the Upper Dale, the reason why it is designated in the first place. And we want to do our part to preserve, protect and enhance it. This is often in conflict with the one-size-fits-all policies of Natural England. The solitude, space and peace, there is no mobile signal here, has given me the mental space to think through some of the more strategic discussions about the ethics of food production. In particular, balancing environmental protection and climate change mitigation with food production. I hope that the reason for the title, A Pittance and a Promise, will become apparent as we move on. The Health and Harmony White Paper, published in 2018, was Michael Gove's blueprint for the future of farming. It laid out proposals to remove all financial support for food production, a legacy of the Common Agricultural Policy, and to replace it with payment for public goods, things that there was not a functioning market both to value and to trade. Public goods include clean air, clean water, biodiversity, landscape and recreation, a green gym if you like, all admirable aspirations which would also contribute to the government's commitment to tackle climate change. It was welcomed by environmental organisations, but despite the efforts of the NFU and other trade organisations, there was only very limited consideration of how the country would be fed in the future. Senior ministers gave unsubstantiated assurance that once Brexit had been completed, free trade would provide all the answers. The discussions remind me very much of the debate in the 1960s between unilateral and multilateral disarmament. The first may be quick and make the country feel good, leading the way, but incredibly naive when none of the other major players follow suit. Little more than a gesture, a forlorn hope with few if any lasting outcomes, while throwing away the only real bargaining counter. The second, multilateral, takes years, requires dogged determination and tenacity, but the results are ultimately peace and stability with a global de-escalation of nuclear war. We have now embarked on the Agricultural Transition Plan, which removes support for farming and replaces it with environmental land management. As a major part of environmental land management, a sustainable farming incentive is currently being developed to be piloted later this year. It will be the main vehicle for paying farmers for all the public goods they produce, which the market does not pay for. This is real free trade ideology, where the market is king and trumps everything else. The UK has always prided itself on its higher environmental and animal welfare regulations. Regulations and culture, animal welfare is of huge importance in the UK, but not necessarily so elsewhere in the world, that just do not exist in many other countries. As a farmer, I may grumble about some of the regulations, especially the more nonsensical ones, and the hoops we have to jump through to prove compliance. But I'm proud that my welfare standards are high and wouldn't have it any other way. I'm proud of the rich flora and fauna on my farm. I look forward to the first curlew arriving in the spring, the scolding of a pair of redshanks if they think I'm getting too near their chicks, and the sea of lemon yellow globe flowers, locally called dumplings, in our meadows in early June. Unfortunately, during my lifetime, returns from rearing and selling livestock on a marginal hill farm have barely covered the costs, let alone provided a reasonable return for my labour and investment. The difference has been made up through various different types of support payments over the years. This is the case across most livestock rearing and arable farms in the UK. After the First World War, Britain turned to its colonies to provide cheap and plentiful food. In the 30s, it was incredibly difficult to scratch a living by farming, and many farms, not just in the hills or on the margins of arable, became derelict and abandoned. During the Second World War, the U-boat menace again made home production of food of paramount importance. But this time, when hostilities ceased, the government did not abandon the unsung heroes of the war effort. The 1948 Agriculture Act introduced support for the hills, now defined as the less favoured areas. This was overdue recognition that the longer winters, harsher climate, poorer soils and shorter growing season would always make it difficult for farms in these areas to compete with those with less natural handicaps. Until 2000, LFA support was a deficiency payment which was fixed annually based on the market prices and production costs. It rightly was not generous, being public money, but gave us the means, pittance if you like, to carry on farming and to continue to churn out the public goods that were a beneficial byproduct of our agricultural activity. In 2000, the payment changed from a headage payment on a farmer's breeding stock to an area payment to ensure compliance with WTO, that's the World Trade Organization, state aid rules. Not particularly recognised at the time, this was a seismic movement as the entitlement to support went from the farmer's asset, the livestock, to the landlord's asset, the land, and seriously weakened the tenant's position. We're now on the cusp of a leap in the dark as free trade ideology drives trade deals which allow in food of dubious environmental and animal welfare credentials into this country. Food which will undercut our own domestic production because it does not have to conform to our production standards. Do not believe the glib comments from government advisers that Australian animal welfare is every bit as good as ours. I've been there and seen with my own eyes. Yes, on some farms, animal welfare is a consideration, but this is definitely not the norm. There are many standard husbandry practices in Australia that would be a criminal offence in the UK. The biggest problem with the agricultural transition plan is that it does not take a holistic approach, integrating food production with environmental protection and ultimately slowing, even reversing, the worst manifestations of climate change. We are awaiting the publishing of an Environment Bill, having had an Agriculture Act that was more about the environment than farming. What we really need is a national food plan, something Minette Batters, the president of the NFU, has long called for to ensure that governmental aspirations for the environment and agriculture actually end up providing the most basic and important outcome, food. What we should be doing is looking to how we can maximise the sustainable production of food that can be produced in this country. Let's face it, we're never likely to be self-sufficient in rice or grapes or coconuts, but we can be with so many other foods. We have good soils, plenty of water and a temperate climate, as well as innovative, multi-skilled farmers. We can really grow things. A lot of our iconic landscapes, the Yorkshire Dales, Dartmoor, my own North Pennines, are not natural landscapes, but ones that have been shaped by generations of farming activity. Species-rich meadows, allotments for waders, dry heath and even blanket bog, all habitats highly prized by environmentalists, were all shaped by generations of farmers. These so-called natural habitats are most definitely man-made, yet they make a vital contribution to some of our cherished landscapes that will be utterly destroyed if they were allowed to revert to scrub. They also provide some of the key components for tackling climate change, particularly carbon sequestration. Here I have over 100 hectares of deep peat, some of it blanket bog, and a wealth of sphagnum moss on my farm. The rest is mainly peaty soil with permanent grass and rough grazing, all of which store and sequester carbon. I can protect this function and produce food, but only through sensitive management and relatively extensive grazing. There are some more efficient production practices we may be able to introduce, but the scope for increasing production is limited. Currently, our balance between the production of food and public goods is win-win, but to be able to provide this function in the future, it needs to be economically sustainable as well. The government is keen that private investment, perhaps through carbon trading and offsetting, will help bear the cost of this in the future. The reward now, if it comes to the farmer rather than the landowner, may only be a pittance, but this time, with the gravity of saving the planet, perhaps the promise will materialise. In this country, peat plays an intriguing role. It predominates on two extremes. The high Pennines, the poorest, most marginal, most extensively farmed land, and in the fens, some of our richest, most productive soils. Land that can produce 3 to 4 crops in 2 years and are vital to our horticultural production, which currently can only produce 50% of what we actually consume in this country. Some environmentalists believe that the priority in the fens should be carbon sequestration, but the food production value may yet turn out to be trumps, especially if the management of that rich land can be done with better soil management, reduced cultivation, less erosion and less emissions. I've always liked the three-legged stool analogy, as 3 legs always find stability, even if the length of the legs is not exactly the same. We need to get away from seeking environmental stability on its own. With many mouths to feed, it is just a pipe dream. Environmental goals need to be integrated with both food production and the cultural knowledge and skills to put it into practice. This to me is the true definition of sustainability. You can't really have any one of them in a sustainable fashion without the others. And then they all collectively need to be financially sustainable. There is a lot of truth in the saying that a farmer needs to be profitable to be green. My final thought is, should we, as a prosperous, westernised country, be looking at reducing our food production when a large proportion of the global population are suffering from inadequate nutrition? Politicians have short memories. It's only 13 years since the world shortage of staple crops, wheat and rice, caused the Arab Spring uprisings that saw regime change in Egypt, Libya and Tunisia, as well as the birth of ISIS and the start of civil war in Syria. In a prosperous country, where barely 10% of our income is spent on food, a doubling of wheat prices has little impact. But in a poor country, where 50% or more of income is spent on food, it is the difference between life and death through starvation. It is worrying that in the news currently, wheat shortages are threatening famines in both North Korea and Ethiopia. Our current policy, driven by free trade ideology, does not value the importance of our sustainable domestic food production or its contribution to the overall global supply. It does not quite grasp that a lot of that domestic production also underpins some of our most treasured habitats and environments. Where it really comes unstuck is at a single-minded drive to improve our environment, to make an awful lot more room for nature, could have disastrous, unforeseen consequences, at least unforeseen by some of our leading environmentalists. Running down domestic production through making it uncompetitive by exposing it to imports not subject to our regulations and costs could actually end up accelerating global warming. The message going out from our government to other countries is, fell your rainforest, intensify production, forget the environment. We promised that Brexit would deliver cheaper food. The Australian trade deal has set that precedent, a precedent which will accelerate global warming as the US, Canada and Brazil ramp up uncontrolled and indiscriminate production to replace our largely responsible and sustainable domestic production. As the hosts of COP21, the big environmental summit in Glasgow later this year, there is still time for our government to listen, understand and rework policy. Boris wants to be able to say, look at the UK, we're leading by example, when he should be leading the way to a global solution, multilateral rather than unilateral. We have 3 grandchildren, so have a strong investment in the future. I've spent my career as a farmer on a pittance and a promise. I hope that will change for the next generation of farmers. They are the key to the future and deserve better. After all, we can live without foreign holidays, without cars, without the latest technological gimmick, but we can't live without food.